You'll beg before the month is over." Julian Sterling said it quietly as he dropped one immaculate white glove into 50 tons of rotting potatoes. 4 weeks earlier, Beatrice Vance had publicly refused the Duke's marriage proposal. Now he owned her family's debt, had stripped away her home, and handed her Blackwood Distillery a leaking brick ruin filled with mold, broken copper, and a harvest so diseased that farmers would not feed it to livestock. Then he made the trap complete. No merchant in the district would sell her barley, no coal dealer would deliver fuel, and any cooper who gave her an oak cask risked losing every sterling contract he possessed. In 4 weeks, Beatrice would either make the debt payment or lose everything that remained. Julian expected the stench, the mud, and the manual labor to break the aristocratic woman who had embarrassed him. Instead, Beatrice picked up one of the ruined potatoes and cut it open. She did not see food. She saw starch. Then, she walked inside the dead distillery, placed her hand near a leaking copper seam, and understood something even more important. Julian had given her a worthless crop, a broken still, and almost no fuel, but he had also given a chemist exactly 4 weeks to discover what all three could become. And when Edinburgh's hospitals finally measured what came out of Blackwood, the Duke would learn that the most expensive mistake of his life had begun with something he considered garbage. Julian Sterling removed one white kid glove before he stepped down from his horse. The yard of Blackwood Distillery was deep with mud, broken crates, and potatoes gone soft from disease. 50 tons of them had been dumped against the eastern wall, where split skins leaked gray water into the ruts. Julian looked at the heap, then at Beatrice Vance. He let the glove fall onto the potatoes. "You refused what I offered you," he said. "Now you may discover what pride costs when no one is paid to keep your hands clean." Beatrice did not look at the glove. She looked past him at Blackwood. Damp had darkened the red brick almost to brown. One chimney leaned enough to cast a crooked shadow across the roof. Through the open loading door, she could see the swollen copper body of an old pot still, its surface green at the seams and blackened above the furnace. Nothing moved inside the building. No belt, pump, or fire made a sound. Only a thin thread of vapor escaped somewhere behind the boiler and vanished into the cold autumn air. Julian's solicitor held out the deed. Blackwood was hers to operate, along with its attached debt. 4 weeks remained before the next payment. Failure would allow Julian to claim what little property the Vance family still possessed. He had also taken precautions against optimism. The maltsters who supplied barley in the district had been told that sterling contracts came first. The coal merchants had received the same message. Any cooper who sold her new oak casks could expect no further work from Julian's breweries. He explained all of this without anger. That was what made the cruelty useful to him. He had arranged the trap carefully enough that he did not need to raise his voice. Beatrice folded the deed once and placed it inside her coat. "Is the boiler included?" Julian's expression tightened by a degree. "Everything you see." She walked past him. Inside, the smell changed from rotting potatoes to wet brick, old yeast, copper oxide, and sour wood. Beatrice crossed to the still and held her palm several inches from the largest seam. A faint breath of warm vapor touched her skin. The boiler had been fired recently, perhaps for Julian's men to prove that it failed. She crouched, examined the rivets, then scraped a green deposit with the edge of a small brass rule she carried in her pocket. The metal beneath was not thin everywhere. Some sections had been neglected rather than destroyed. She moved to the furnace. The grate was cracked. The ash pit contained only splinters and half-burned wood, no coal. Beside it stood a worm condenser clouded with scale. One fermentation vat had collapsed at the base, but 2 others remained upright beneath their mold. Blackwood was ruined in the way an abandoned machine was ruined. Several failures had been allowed to accumulate until no single person wanted responsibility for the whole. Julian appeared in the doorway. "You have 4 weeks, Miss Vance." Beatrice straightened. Mud had reached the hem of her skirt. "Then I should not spend the first day discussing them." For the first time, his composure showed strain. It vanished almost immediately. He turned toward his horse, leaving the solicitor to follow. Only after the hoofbeats had faded did Beatrice return to the yard. Two former laborers remained near the gate, watching her with the guarded curiosity reserved for someone expected to leave before wages became due. Beatrice took a knife from an abandoned sorting table and cut into one of the diseased potatoes. The outer tissue collapsed beneath the blade. She cut deeper. The center was pale, dense, and wet, not yet consumed by rot. She rubbed a small piece between her fingers. The cell walls had softened badly. That was why the merchants considered the crop worthless. It would not store. It would not travel. Much of it could no longer be sold for food. But softness was not the same as emptiness. Her father had once made her weigh potato starch until she could recognize its texture before the scale confirmed it. Heat, water, and the right treatment could break that starch down into sugars. Yeast did not care whether a carbohydrate had once been intended for a dining table. Beatrice cut a second potato, then a third. Some were beyond use, others were not. Behind her, Blackwood's leaking boiler released another thin breath of vapor. Julian had denied her barley because he believed barley was what a distillery required. He had denied her coal because he believed heat could come from only the fuel he controlled. Then he had left her 50 tons of material no one else wanted. Beatrice looked from the softened potato in her hand to the silent copper still. The first question was no longer whether Blackwood was worthless. It was how much of Julian's punishment could still be made to ferment. By noon, Beatrice had stopped thinking of the potatoes as one heap. She ordered the 2 remaining laborers to bring 3 empty carts into the yard. Potatoes that had collapsed into foul-smelling pulp went into the first. Those with blackened skins but firm centers went into the second. The third held the uncertain ones, which she cut before deciding. The work was slow, wet, and unpleasant. By the second hour, brown liquid had soaked through her gloves, and the men had stopped watching to see when she would give up. She did not save everything. That mattered. Anything carrying deep putrefaction went straight to waste. Beatrice would not build a process around pretending spoiled material was sound. But a surprising portion of Julian's 50 tons had been rejected because the crop could no longer be stored or sold as food, not because every useful part of the tubers had vanished. Inside the distillery, she grated several samples into separate ceramic bowls, added warm water, and treated them as her father once had, when testing unfamiliar starches. A few drops of iodine darkened the mixtures almost at once. There was still carbohydrate here, a great deal of it. The problem was getting it into a form yeast could use. Beatrice wrote the result in a small notebook, then turned to the building itself. She measured the temperature in the fermentation room, checked the warped lids on the surviving vats, scraped mold from the upper staves, and marked 2 vessels for possible recovery. The condenser was clogged with scale but intact. Several lengths of copper pipe could be cleaned. The furnace bricks needed resetting. The boiler worried her most. She tapped its surface with a small hammer. Healthy copper answered sharply. Near one lower seam, the sound went dull. One of the laborers, a narrow-faced man named Kerr, shifted his weight. That seam's leaked since spring. Who repaired it? No one. Who was supposed to? Kerr glanced toward the doorway before answering. Brody would have. The name meant nothing to her. He worked copper for Sterling, Kerr continued. Still bodies, worms, pipe joints, 30 years, maybe more. His hands started shaking after an injury. His grace dismissed him. Can he still solder? Kerr gave a humorless little shrug. Better than most men who don't shake. Beatrice closed the notebook. They found Mr. Brody in a cottage beyond the old quarry road, repairing a kettle for a widow who could pay him only with eggs. He was 55, broad through the shoulders despite a bent left leg, with burn marks across 2 fingers, and a tremor that became more obvious when his hands were empty. Beatrice told him what Blackwood needed. He refused before she finished. I know that boiler, he said, and I know who owns the debt on it. I own the deed for 4 weeks. You own the trouble. Sterling owns what happens after. Beatrice placed a small purse on his workbench. It contained less than he expected, and more than she could comfortably lose. I am not asking you to oppose him, she said. I am asking whether the copper can be made safe enough for one controlled run. That changed the question. Brody came to Blackwood before dusk. He ignored the smell, ignored the potatoes, and spent 20 minutes doing almost exactly what Beatrice had done, tapping copper, studying rivets, testing joints with his thumb. His hand trembled badly when he reached overhead. When he braced his wrist against the still, it steadied. At the lower seam, he scraped away green corrosion and exposed the metal beneath. Ugly, he said. Unsafe? Not yet. He showed her where old solder had fractured around 3 rivets, and where a patch had been fitted badly years earlier. The boiler shell itself still had thickness. Repair would require cleaning the joint back to sound metal, resetting the weak rivets, and sweating fresh solder into the seam. They would lose at least a day. Beatrice looked toward the yard. Every lost day consumed part of Julian's 4-week advantage. Do it properly, she said. Brody studied her for a moment, then took off his coat. By nightfall, the first damaged seam had been opened, cleaned, and prepared. Beatrice had spent money she could not replace. 1 fermentation vat had been declared beyond saving. Nearly 1/5 of the potatoes inspected so far had gone directly to waste. Yet the list of usable things was growing. 2 vats, a condenser, most of the boiler shell, several 100 pounds of recoverable copper fittings, and far more starch than Julian had understood when he ordered the diseased crop dumped at her door. Brody wiped his hands on a cloth and looked up into the broad onion-shaped head of the old pot still. You can make spirit with this once I'm finished, he said. Beatrice waited. He glanced toward the notebook in her hand. But if you're trying to make something clean enough for surgeons, fixing the leak won't fix your real problem. She looked at the still again. The boiler, it seemed, was only the first failure Blackwood had hidden. Brody needed most of the next day to finish the boiler seam, which gave Beatrice exactly one useful thing: time to solve the problem inside the potatoes. She chose 300 pounds from the soundest part of the sorted heap, and had Kerr wash them in cold water until the runoff stopped carrying mud. The skins remained scarred and dark, but the flesh beneath was pale. They chopped the tubers with iron spades, crushed them with a wooden rammer, and tipped the mash into one of the vats Beatrice had already scrubbed with boiling water. The first obstacle appeared before the yeast did. Potatoes carried starch. Yeast needed sugar. At her father's laboratory table, years earlier, Beatrice had learned never to confuse a substance with what it might become. He had made her repeat tests until she stopped guessing from appearance. Heat changed structure. Acids changed bonds. Temperature changed which reactions occurred quickly enough to matter. Those lessons returned now because the mash in front of her was too thick for theory. She heated a small portion first, not the whole vat. If the treatment failed, she intended to lose a bowl rather than a day's crop. A measured quantity of dilute acid went into the warm mash. Beatrice watched the thermometer, kept the mixture below a violent boil, and tested samples as the starch began to break down. The familiar dark reaction weakened. The liquid became thinner. Afterward, she neutralized the test portion before allowing yeast anywhere near it. Brody watched from the furnace doorway. You always work this slowly? When I cannot afford to repeat a mistake. That sounds expensive. Repeating it is more expensive. The test fermented. Only then did she scale the process to the larger vat. The work consumed nearly all the clean water they had heated that morning, and more firewood than Beatrice liked. By late afternoon, the yard smelled less of decay and more of cooked earth, sour mash, smoke, and wet timber. The laborers carried buckets until their shoulders ached. Beatrice recorded every addition and every temperature, because Blackwood could not survive on a recipe that existed only in memory. That evening, another problem emerged. The fermentation room was losing heat almost as quickly as they could make it. Autumn nights near Edinburgh were already cold enough to slow the yeast, and Beatrice refused to burn their remaining dry wood simply to warm brick walls. She walked outside to the waste cart, where the potatoes too spoiled to process had begun heating in their own decomposition. Steam, barely visible in the dusk, rose when Kerr drove a fork into the pile. Beatrice held her hand over it. Warm, not hot enough to run a still, not even close, but enough to matter somewhere else. They moved the decomposing waste into shallow, covered heaps along the outside wall of the fermentation room and packed straw around the weakest sections of brick. The heat from decay would not boil anything. It did not need to. If it kept the room a few degrees warmer through the night, the yeast could continue working without consuming fuel reserved for distillation. By morning, the thermometer inside the room had fallen less than Beatrice expected. More important, the vat was alive. Foam gathered at the edges. Small bubbles rose through the mash and broke with soft, regular sounds. The air carried the sharp, warm smell of fermentation instead of simple rot. Kerr leaned over the vat. "So it works. It has begun," Beatrice corrected. For 3 days, she treated that distinction seriously. She checked temperature before dawn and again after sunset. She adjusted the waste heaps when their heat fell. She sampled the mash, watched its sweetness diminish, and refused to rush the still, simply because Julian's deadline remained visible in her notebook. Brody finished the boiler during the same period. He reset 3 weakened rivets, cleaned the old joint back to sound copper, and laid new solder into the seam. When they tested it with heated water, the metal expanded, without releasing the thin ribbon of vapor Beatrice had seen on her first day. One failure had been removed. The larger one remained. On the 4th morning, Beatrice tested the fermented wash again and closed her notebook. It was ready enough for a trial. Brody looked toward the stack of firewood beside the furnace. Half of it was still damp. The dry portion might carry them through one careful run, but little more. "If the fire drops," he said, "your cuts will wander." "I know. And if this old pot gives you dirty spirit, then we find out why." He glanced at the vat. "That is several days of work." Beatrice looked at the same thing. The mash represented potatoes they could not recover, fuel they could not replace easily, wages already owed, and 4 days taken from a deadline Julian had designed to crush her. Waiting would preserve the material and prove nothing. Running the still could destroy it. She chose the latter. By noon, the repaired boiler held its first charge. Brody sealed the access point. Kerr fed the driest wood into the furnace. Beatrice placed her thermometer, where she could read it without leaving the receiver, and arranged separate vessels for the liquid that would emerge at different stages. The first flames caught unevenly. Smoke pushed back from the cracked brickwork before the draft strengthened. The copper began to warm with slow metallic ticks. Water moved through the condenser. Beatrice stood beside the receiver with her notebook open, listening as Blackwood made sounds it had not made in months. Then, from deep inside the apparatus, came the first faint movement of vapor. The fermentation had worked. Now the repaired pot still had to prove whether it could separate anything worth selling. The first liquid reached the receiver shortly after 2 in the afternoon. Beatrice did not celebrate. She changed the vessel. The earliest fraction carried a sharp, solvent-like odor that caught in the back of the throat. She marked the time, the temperature at the head of the still, and the volume before setting the jar aside. The fire beneath the boiler had already begun to fluctuate. Damp wood hissed instead of burning cleanly, and Kerr had to keep opening the furnace door to rearrange the load. Every interruption changed the heat. Every change in heat changed what came through the condenser. The next fraction looked clearer. Beatrice measured its strength with the hydrometer, waited for the reading to settle, and wrote the number down. Too low. She collected another jar, then another. For nearly 3 hours, Blackwood produced spirit that seemed close enough to success to become dangerous. The liquid was transparent. It burned. A man interested only in selling something might have stopped there. Beatrice did not. She smelled each fraction separately. The early jars were harsh and volatile. The middle run improved, but lacked the strength she needed. Later samples became heavier, carrying more water and an oily odor that remained on the glass after the liquid evaporated. Brody stood beside the furnace, his face darkened with soot. "How bad?" "Not one problem," she said. She arranged the jars in order across the work table. The pot still had separated the wash, but only crudely. A single batch produced changing fractions that overlapped too broadly whenever the fire rose or fell. To obtain cleaner spirit, she could redistill the best portion again, and perhaps again after that. She calculated the fuel. Then she calculated it a second time. There was not enough. Even if they sacrificed every dry board that could be removed from Blackwood without damaging the roof, repeated pot distillation would consume days and fuel faster than they could produce saleable volume. Kerr lifted one of the middle jars toward the window. "It looks clean." Beatrice took it from him and poured a measured spoonful into a shallow dish. Looking clean is not the same thing. She touched a flame to it. The spirit caught, but the flame was uneven and yellow at its edges. When it died, a faint odor remained above the dish. She repeated the test with another fraction. Better, but still inconsistent. The hydrometer told the same story more precisely. Blackwood could make alcohol. It could not yet make the same alcohol twice. That was the difference between a curiosity and a product. Late in the afternoon, hoofbeats sounded outside. Julian had not come alone. His estate steward rode beside him, and neither man dismounted. From the yard, the rejected spirit could be seen running through a drain where Beatrice had ordered the unusable fractions emptied, rather than mixed back into the next batch. Julian watched the stream disappear into the mud. I had wondered how long chemistry would survive contact with arithmetic. Beatrice continued rinsing the receiving jar. "You have burned 4 days," he said, "and now you are pouring the result onto the ground." "Yes." His steward looked toward the stacked potatoes, and then away. Julian waited, perhaps expecting explanation, anger, or an appeal. Beatrice gave him none. At last he turned his horse. "I will send someone at the end of the month to inventory what remains." The hoofbeats receded. Only then did Kerr speak. "You could have sold some of it." "To whom?" He had no answer. Brody closed the furnace damper. "So we run it twice." Beatrice looked at the woodpile. "No." Brody frowned. She carried the notebook to the workbench and opened it beside several pages she had copied years before from her father's experiments. Temperature ranges, vapor behavior, repeated observations of alcohol and water mixtures under heat. A pot still asked one vessel to perform one broad separation at a time. That was the problem. Beatrice drew the boiler first. Above it, instead of the familiar rounded copper head, she drew a narrow vertical line. Then another. She began adding horizontal marks inside it. Brody leaned closer. "What are those?" "Stages." "For what?" "For making the vapor separate itself more than once before it reaches the condenser." She pointed to the discarded jars. "If one distillation is too weak, the answer is not necessarily to burn enough fuel for 3. Outside, the last of Julian's horses disappeared beyond the gate. Beatrice added another horizontal line to the drawing. The failed batch had cost 4 days, several hundred pounds of potatoes, and most of their best firewood. It had also told her exactly what Blackwood could no longer afford to keep doing. Brody stared at Beatrice's drawing until the light from the workshop window moved halfway across the page. "You want to put all of that above the boiler?" "I want the vapor to meet liquid more than once, before it reaches the condenser." "That is not the same answer." "No." He looked up at the ceiling beams, measuring height with his eyes. Blackwood had been built for a broad copper head, not a narrow tower. The roof would take the height if they worked between 2 joists. The greater problem was copper. They had almost none to spare. Brody led her through the dead side of the distillery with a hammer and a lantern. They stripped sheet from an unused spirit warmer, removed 2 lengths of pipe from a collapsed wash line, and opened a storage cupboard containing old fittings green with corrosion. Nothing matched. Every useful piece would have to be cleaned, reshaped, riveted, or soldered. Beatrice counted what they recovered before she allowed anything to be cut. Brody noticed. "You count metal the way other people count money. At present, it is money." They began with the column shell. Brody rolled the salvaged copper around a wooden form, while Kerr held the edge in place. His left hand trembled whenever he lifted it free. When he braced his forearm against the bench, the movement diminished enough for him to mark the rivet line. Beatrice did not offer to take the hammer. She understood boiling behavior. Brody understood what happened to copper when a badly supported seam was heated and cooled 50 times. Blackwood needed both kinds of knowledge, and confusing them would only produce another expensive failure. Inside the column, they fitted a series of shallow, perforated plates. Each plate would catch part of the condensed liquid as vapor rose through it. Hot vapor would pass upward, Liquid would fall back, and the exchange would repeat on the next level. Instead of asking one pot still to make one broad separation, Beatrice intended to force the mixture through several smaller ones before it escaped the top. The work took 2 days. That cost frightened her more than the labor. No spirit was being produced while they built. The potatoes continued to soften. Wages accumulated. The stack of dry firewood had become low enough that Kerr stopped feeding the workshop stove before sunset. On the second evening, Brodie burned his thumb while sealing the highest joint. He swore once, wrapped the hand in cloth, and went back to work. Beatrice stopped him. "The seam will still be there tomorrow. So will your deadline. A poor joint may be there much longer." He looked at her, then at his shaking fingers. For once, he listened. They changed another part of the design before morning. The first condenser arrangement had wasted heat into the yard. Beatrice rerouted the cooling water so that, after warming against the outgoing vapor, it passed through a coil beside the incoming wash. The water could not run the still. It could, however, raise the wash temperature before it entered the boiler. Every degree gained there was one they did not have to buy with firewood. For the column itself, they built a wooden outer casing from dry pine boards, leaving an air gap around the copper and packing the space with non-flammable insulating material available to them. The spirit vapor remained inside metal. The wood merely slowed the loss of heat to the room. On the third morning, they charged the repaired boiler. Beatrice had prepared separate receivers again. This time the fire remained small but constant. The first vapor climbed into the new column. At the lowest plate, condensation formed and spread in a thin, trembling layer. More vapor rose through it. Droplets fell back toward the boiler, while the lighter portion continued upward. Beatrice watched the thermometer. Brodie watched the joints. Kerr watched for leaks. No one spoke. The first output was diverted immediately. Beatrice smelled it, marked it as heads, and set it aside for rejection. She adjusted the reflux, waited, then changed receivers. Nothing emerged for several minutes. Kerr shifted beside her. Then a drop formed at the end of the outlet. It fell into the glass receiver. Another followed. Then another. The liquid was clear enough that the bottom of the vessel remained sharply visible through it. Beatrice allowed a small quantity to collect before lowering the hydrometer. The instrument settled. She read it once. Then again. Brodie leaned toward her. "Well, higher than the pot still ever gave us." She did not smile yet. The figure was close to what she had been seeking, but one clear receiver could still be an accident of temperature, timing, or luck. She marked the reading, adjusted the reflux by a fraction, and placed a second clean vessel beneath the outlet. Blackwood had finally produced spirit that looked like the product she had imagined. Now Beatrice had to prove the machine could do it again. Beatrice did not test the second receiver with a flame. She tested it with numbers. The hydrometer settled almost where the first reading had. She recorded the temperature, corrected for it, then marked the volume collected before changing vessels again. Brodie watched from the column while Kerr kept the furnace at the same low, even draft. By sunset, they had 3 usable fractions from the run. None were identical. They were close enough to matter. The next morning, Beatrice changed one variable at a time. The potato mash was weighed more carefully. Water was measured instead of estimated by bucket depth. Fermentation temperature was recorded at fixed hours. Most important, she wrote down exactly when the early volatile fraction was diverted and when the heart of the run began. Blackwood could not depend on her standing beside the still forever. A process that worked only when one person guessed correctly was not a process. The second batch reached a little above 94% alcohol in its cleanest portion. The third approached 95. The fourth returned almost the same reading as the second. Beatrice placed the 4 entries beside one another in the notebook. Brodie leaned over her shoulder. "That enough for you?" "It is beginning to be. You have a difficult definition of enough. It has kept us from poisoning anyone." That silenced him. They rejected the sharp, early fractions without argument. Later, when the heavier odors began appearing, Beatrice ended the heart collection rather than chase another few pints of volume. Every gallon discarded hurt. But by the end of the week, the clear spirit accumulating in sealed stoneware looked and smelled unlike the first dirty pot-still batch. It was stronger, more neutral, and repeatable. They needed someone outside Blackwood to say whether that difference had value. Dr. Samuel Hargreaves kept a small surgical practice 2 miles closer to Edinburgh. Beatrice carried one stoneware jar to him herself, sealed with cork and wax, along with a page listing its strength and production date. He looked first at the jar, then at her mud-stained cuffs. Potato spirit? Rectified potato spirit. His expression suggested the distinction had not improved matters. Beatrice did not ask him to trust her explanation. She asked him to test the contents. Hargreaves uncorked the jar, poured a small measure onto clean glass, and waited. He smelled what remained after evaporation. Then he compared it with the grain spirit already on his shelf. The difference was not dramatic enough for theater. It was useful enough for work. Blackwood's spirit left less of the heavy grain odor he disliked when preparing tinctures and cleaning instruments. Its high alcohol strength also meant he could dilute it deliberately, rather than begin with an uncertain product. How much of this can you make? Not enough yet. That was not my question. Beatrice looked at the shelves behind him. Bottles, bandages, instruments, small quantities ordered because clean spirit had become expensive. With steady feedstock and storage, she said, hundreds of gallons. Hargreaves bought the jar. The payment was modest. Beatrice carried the coins back to Blackwood and placed them beside the production notebook. It was the first money the distillery had earned since she arrived. Kerr stared at it, as if the coins might disappear. Brodie did not. He pointed instead to the empty place where the stoneware jar had stood. One sold jar does not make an industry. No, Beatrice said. But it makes the next batch easier to justify. The following afternoon, Hargreaves returned. He brought a cart. I want 6 more. This time Kerr smiled before he could stop himself. Hargreaves also brought a question from an apothecary he knew in Edinburgh. The man prepared medicinal extracts and complained constantly that strong grain spirit carried too much character into preparations intended to carry something else. Could Blackwood provide samples? Beatrice looked toward the column. That question changed more than the order. Julian's distilleries were designed to make spirits whose grain character had value. Their casks, methods, and reputation all served that market. Blackwood was doing something different. Its best product possessed almost no character at all. For drinking, that might have seemed a defect. For medicine, extraction, and laboratory work, neutrality could be the advantage. Beatrice wrote the Edinburgh apothecary's name beneath the day's hydrometer readings. Across the county, 6 jars were not enough to frighten Julian Sterling. But someone would eventually tell him what those jars were being used for. And when he understood that Beatrice was not competing for his customers, but creating access to a market he had never thought worth separating from his own, 6 jars would become more dangerous than 600 bottles of ordinary liquor. The first farmer arrived at Blackwood before breakfast with a cart of potatoes no grocer would take. By noon there were 3. Beatrice inspected every load before agreeing on a price. Tubers collapsed into foul pulp were rejected. Those scarred by blight but still holding firm starch went onto the processing floor. She paid less than food market rates, but she paid in cash, which mattered to men facing an autumn crop they had expected to bury. Within a week, Blackwood no longer smelled like abandonment. It smelled like work. Washed potatoes struck the chopping tables in steady rhythms. Mash vats were marked with chalk by date and treatment. Fermentation started in staggered batches so that one vessel matured while another was being filled and a third emptied. Kerr took responsibility for temperatures at dawn. Brodie inspected every copper joint before the first fire was lit. Beatrice kept the cuts herself. Heads were diverted early. Hearts were collected only while the hydrometer and odor remained within the range she had established. Tails went elsewhere rather than being allowed to weaken a medical batch for the sake of a few extra pints. The discipline reduced volume. It also made the product predictable. That was what brought the Edinburgh apothecary to Blackwood. He arrived expecting a crude farm spirit and spent nearly an hour studying the batch records instead. Beatrice showed him 3 production dates, 3 corrected strength readings, and the quantity rejected from each run. He asked why she recorded what she threw away. Because yield means nothing if I hide the cost of purity. He read that line twice. 2 days later, an invitation arrived for Blackwood to submit samples to an upcoming hospital procurement trial in Edinburgh. Suppliers would be judged on strength, consistency, storage, and the ability to deliver meaningful volume. Julian Sterling held the current medical account. Beatrice read the notice once, then carried it directly to the production floor. "How much?" Brody asked. "Enough that 6 jars will not impress them." They began scaling. 2 unused vats were repaired. A cracked wash pump was replaced with a manual transfer arrangement built from salvaged pipe. Farmers were given delivery days to prevent the yard from filling faster than the sorting crew could work. Beatrice used the warm condenser water to preheat incoming wash and tracked fuel consumed per gallon. The numbers improved, not dramatically, reliably. 3 more workers were hired. For the first time since Beatrice had arrived, wages were paid from Blackwood's own sales, rather than the dwindling money she had brought with her. That fact traveled faster than any advertisement. So did another. Julian learned what the Edinburgh trial was for. He did not ride to Blackwood. He sent letters. The first cooper Beatrice visited apologized before she finished asking for casks. His workshop depended on Sterling orders. Selling her 12 oak barrels was not worth losing work for the rest of the year. The second man would not even quote a price. At the third yard, Beatrice saw rows of finished casks standing beneath canvas and understood that scarcity was not the problem. Control was. She returned to Blackwood without buying one. Brody found her counting the storage already on hand. 6 stoneware jars, 3 small glass carboys, 2 receiving vessels needed beside the still. Nothing remotely sufficient for the production required before Edinburgh. "You could slow the column," he said, "and arrive with samples instead of supply. Better than making spirit we cannot keep." Beatrice looked toward the fermentation room. Inside, 4 vats were already active. Another farmer was due the following morning. The system she had built was finally producing material faster than Julian had expected, now that success had become its own danger. Alcohol at Blackwood's proof could not remain in open receivers for long. Every hour exposed to air meant loss. Every gallon without a sealed vessel was value literally disappearing into the room. Beatrice checked the inventory again. The cooperatives were closed to her. The procurement trial was approaching, and by the end of the week, Blackwood would be producing more clean spirit than it had any safe place to put. Julian had failed to stop the distillery from working, so he had chosen something more effective. He had decided to make its success impossible to store. The loss became visible before anyone understood it. Kerr entered the storage room at dawn, stopped beside the largest temporary receiver, and called for Beatrice. She came carrying the night ledger. A dark line marked the inside of the vessel where the spirit had stood the previous evening. The liquid now rested several inches below it. Beatrice measured the difference. Then she checked the second receiver. The same thing had happened there. Loose covers and hastily fitted corks had slowed evaporation, but Blackwood's strongest spirit was too volatile for improvised storage. Between evaporation, transfer losses, and one leaking seal, nearly 20% of the previous day's clean production was gone. No broken pipe had caused it. No worker had stolen it. The product had simply escaped into the air. Kerr stared at the figures in her notebook. "We can run the column longer." "No, we have wash ready, and nowhere safe to put what comes out." The answer frustrated him because it was correct. Beatrice reduced the still rate that morning. Every instinct urged the opposite. Edinburgh was approaching. The fermentation room held enough active mash to keep the column working day and night. But increasing output without storage would convert potatoes, wages, and firewood into vapor. She spent the morning measuring what remained. By noon, she knew exactly how bad the position was. They had enough sealed vessels for samples. Not enough for a contract. Brody found her beside one of Julian's old cask racks, staring at the empty iron supports. "He knew where to hit us," he said. "Yes, you sound impressed. I am trying not to make the mistake of underestimating him." Oak casks had solved the storage problem in Julian's world because his world had been built around beverage, spirit transport, aging, warehouses, cooperatives. Beatrice had accepted the same assumption because everyone in distilling accepted it. She ran her hand across the empty rack. Then she stopped. Blackwood was not aging whiskey. It was trying to preserve neutral spirit without adding anything to it. "Why oak?" she asked. Brody frowned. "Because that is what spirits go into." That is not an answer. She went back through the inventory of everything they had successfully used. Stoneware, glass, waxed cork, materials Julian did not control, because his own distilleries had little use for them at scale. That afternoon, Beatrice drove toward the dairy farms south of Blackwood. The first farmer laughed when she asked about old ceramic milk vessels. Then he showed her 12. 2 were cracked, 3 were too small, 7 were sound. At the next farm she found 9 more. A merchant in the village had glass carboys wrapped in old wicker that had been sitting unsold behind sacks of salt. Another dairy, recently closed after a bad season, had large, salt-glazed stoneware churns, whose only defect was that no one needed them anymore. Beatrice bought almost everything usable. It consumed the last comfortable portion of her cash. By evening, Blackwood's yard was filled with mismatched vessels. They looked ridiculous beside the equipment of a respectable distillery. That did not matter. Each one was scrubbed, rinsed, dried, inspected for cracks, and tested with water before receiving spirit. Brody fashioned simple metal clamps where the necks allowed it. Corks were driven tight and sealed with a wax-based compound. Wicker baskets were repaired so the glass carboys could travel without striking one another. Beatrice marked every vessel with its batch number. The next morning she weighed and measured the sealed containers. They checked them again after several hours. No meaningful loss. By afternoon, the column was running at full working rate again. Kerr carried a sealed stoneware churn into the storage room and placed it where an oak cask should have stood. "His Grace will hate these." Beatrice checked the stopper. "They are not for him." That evening, she wrote to the Edinburgh Procurement Committee. Blackwood would attend. It would bring samples from separate production dates, full batch records, and a declared delivery capacity based on the inventory now being sealed in stoneware and glass. Brody read the final line before she folded the page. "You are committing to the volume?" "Yes. We are not there yet." "No. Then why sign it?" Beatrice looked through the workshop door at the mismatched vessels filling one wall from floor to shoulder height. Because until that moment, failure had still been private. A bad batch could be discarded. A leaking vessel could be replaced. A weak process could be redesigned. The Edinburgh trial would be different. Julian would be there. So would the buyers. So would the instruments. Beatrice signed her name. From then on, Blackwood was no longer trying merely to survive the deadline. It had promised, in writing, to prove that survival could be measured. The Edinburgh Committee had arranged the trial in a long hospital workroom with high windows, whitewashed walls, and enough open table space to make every claim visible. Julian Sterling arrived first. His men rolled in polished oak casks marked with the Sterling crest. The cooperage was excellent. The brass fittings shone. Each barrel looked expensive enough to answer questions before anyone asked them. Blackwood arrived in stoneware. The contrast drew attention immediately. Beatrice's containers were mismatched in size and color, some cream, some brown, several still carrying the faint marks of their former use in dairies. Each one, however, was sealed, numbered, and matched to a production entry in the notebook she placed on the table. Julian looked at the row. "This is the standard now?" Beatrice did not answer him. She answered the committee. "Separate batches, separate dates, separate vessels. You may choose the samples yourselves." That mattered. One of the hospital apothecaries selected 3 containers from different parts of the shipment. Brody broke the seals only after their numbers were recorded. The liquid was poured into clean measuring cylinders, and the committee used its own hydrometers. Beatrice kept her hands away from the instruments. The first reading settled above 94%. The second came close to 95%. The third fell within the same narrow range. No one applauded. The men at the table simply wrote the figures down. Julian's expression did not change, but he asked to have his own spirit tested. It was strong. It was also less neutral. That was the distinction Beatrice had come to prove. Equal measures of both spirits were placed on clean glass surfaces and allowed to evaporate. The sterling sample left a heavier grain aroma behind. Blackwood's residue was fainter. One surgeon leaned closer. For cleaning alone, perhaps irrelevant. For extraction, the apothecary beside him said, less so. Beatrice opened her records. She showed them the amount of heads rejected from each run, the cut into the heart fraction, the corrected alcohol readings, and the yield from the potato mash. She did not hide the 20% storage loss. One committee member noticed it. You lost this much? Yes. And still came? Yes. What changed? Storage. She indicated the stoneware. We stopped treating a medical spirit as if it needed to be stored like drinking spirit. That produced the first silence Julian could not control. His oak casks were beautiful. They were also no longer proof of superiority. Dr. Hargreaves had come as an outside witness. He described purchasing Blackwood's first jar, then returning for 6 more. He did not call Beatrice brilliant. He said something more useful. The strength was repeatable. The odor was lower. I could dilute it deliberately rather than guess what I had bought. Julian stepped forward then. And how much can she actually supply? It was the right question. Beatrice had expected it. Brodie brought in the final production sheet. Nearly 600 gallons had been produced to the standard range for the trial and current delivery schedule, divided among sealed stoneware and glass vessels. Additional wash was already fermenting at Blackwood. Julian looked at the number. For the first time that day, he did not speak immediately. The committee requested one final demonstration. A measured amount of sterling spirit was applied to clean white material and ignited under controlled conditions. The flame burned well, but the heavier aroma remained afterward. Blackwood's sample followed. The flame was cleaner and bluer. When it died, the cloth remained visibly cleaner. Beatrice did not point at it. She did not need to. The hydrometer readings had already spoken. The batch records had already spoken. The repeated production had already spoken. The flame merely gave the eye what the notebook had given the table. The committee withdrew for less than half an hour. When they returned, the chairman addressed Julian first. The sterling supply would not be renewed for the medical account under its existing terms. Then he turned to Beatrice. Blackwood would receive a recurring order, beginning with the volume already declared, with an advance against the first scheduled delivery. The advance was enough to cover the payment due on Blackwood, enough to keep the workers paid, enough to prevent Julian from exercising the claim he had expected to use at the end of the month. Around the room, clerks began recording the new arrangement. Julian remained beside his oak casks. Beatrice stood beside the stoneware vessels he had never thought worth controlling. She had not beaten him by making better whiskey. She had made something his system had never been designed to value. And now, the market had measured the difference. The advance from Edinburgh arrived 3 days before Julian's payment was due. Beatrice did not use it to buy back a carriage, jewelry, or any visible piece of the life she had lost. She paid the debt installment first. Then, she paid wages. Only after both receipts were signed did she authorize Brodie to order new copper sheet for the column and enough firebrick to rebuild the worst section of the furnace. Blackwood remained ugly for some time. That was deliberate. The roof was repaired, where rain threatened production. The fermentation room received tighter doors. A proper storage chamber was built along the north wall, where temperature changed more slowly. Shelves were designed for stoneware and wicker-wrapped glass rather than oak casks. The old brick exterior could wait. Every pound Beatrice spent had to make the next gallon safer, cheaper, or more consistent. The farmers noticed the difference before the town did. Blackwood began issuing purchase dates for blighted and surplus potatoes that still met Beatrice's processing standard. Loads that would once have been dumped or left to rot now arrived, weighed, inspected, and paid for. Not every crop was accepted. Beatrice insisted on that. The distillery would not survive by becoming careless merely because desperation created supply. Kerr trained 2 new workers to sort the incoming loads. Brodie took charge of copper maintenance, drawing wages higher than he had earned during his final year under Sterling. When Beatrice told him the figure, he stared at the paper. That is too much. It is what replacing you would cost." His mouth moved as though he might object again. He signed instead. By winter, the hospital order had become a schedule rather than an event. Blackwood shipped sealed neutral spirit at regular intervals. Batch numbers traveled with every vessel. The production notebook became 3 notebooks, then 5. The original pot still remained at the center of the system, its repaired seams visible beneath newer fittings. Beatrice refused to polish those scars away. They were useful. A worker could point to any one of them and explain what failed there, what had been changed, and why. Julian's losses were quieter. His grain distilleries continued to operate. He was not ruined overnight, and no one expected a duke's fortune to disappear because of one medical contract. But the contract mattered beyond its value. Coopers who had obeyed him discovered that Blackwood no longer needed them in the same way. Farmers who once depended on grain prices now had another buyer for damaged starch crops. Apothecaries who had accepted whatever strong spirit the established houses offered began asking questions about neutrality, proof, and residue. Julian had tried to make Beatrice dependent on his supply network. Instead, he had taught her where to remove it. The last legal hold he possessed over the Vance property came due for settlement in early spring. He came to Blackwood himself. No escort rode beside him this time. His coat was immaculate. His gloves were new. Beatrice received him in the small office overlooking the production floor. Between them lay the final release document. Julian read it without hurry. "You have done well," he said. It was not an apology. Beatrice did not reward it as one. "The amount is correct." His jaw tightened. "You always did prefer figures. They are difficult to intimidate." He looked through the window behind her. Below, workers moved sealed vessels onto a wagon bound for Edinburgh. Brodie stood beside the loading platform inspecting a metal clamp. Kerr called out batch numbers as each container passed. None of them looked toward the office. Julian signed. The pen made a small scratching sound across the paper. That was all. No confession repaired what he had done. No humiliation could return the months he had spent trying to reduce her to dependence. The signature mattered because it changed something real. The claim was gone. Blackwood could no longer be taken from her through the debt he had purchased. Beatrice sanded the ink, folded the release, and placed it with the property papers. Julian remained standing. For a moment, it seemed he expected some final acknowledgement of what had passed between them. She gave him none. He left through the same yard, where he had once dropped a white kid glove into a heap of diseased potatoes. The original glove was still there, though barely recognizable. Rain, mud, fermentation waste, and months of weather had turned the white leather gray-brown and drawn it tight around itself. It lay beneath the edge of an old broken crate, too ruined even for a laborer to mistake it for something worth saving. Kerr found it while clearing space for another potato delivery. He lifted it with the end of a rake. "What do you want done with this?" Beatrice glanced at it once. "Throw it away." He did. That afternoon, she returned to the laboratory above the production room. On the table stood a sealed bottle from the newest batch. Beatrice checked the number against the record, broke the temporary testing seal, and lowered the hydrometer into a glass cylinder. Below her, the column worked at a steady rate. Warm wash entered through the preheating system. Vapor climbed copper plates. Condensate returned. Clean spirit collected where, months earlier, Blackwood had produced nothing worth keeping. The hydrometer settled. The reading was inside the range. Beatrice wrote it down. Outside, another farmer's cart entered the yard, carrying potatoes no food merchant would have bought. The gate closed behind it. Blackwood kept working.